gaming market slowly becoming more iterative than even the film industry, credit for innovation and originality in game development ought to be given where it's due. I can think of no developer more deserving of these kudos than the relatively new That Game Company, whose focus on emotion rather than mechanics or message in their games has proved to be a much-needed respite from the trite titles of today. While the company's much-acclaimed title Journey has been stealing the show as of late, I want to focus on Flower, the second game produced by That Game Company. Released in February of 2009, Flower takes the player into the dreams of ordinary household plants. This is a novel concept to begin with, but Flower is a great deal more than just a unique experience. I'm not the first person to review Flower, and admittedly I'm quite late to the party. However, many reviewers praise the game for its quirky idea or for the gorgeous graphics and well-integrated motion controls, but neglect to mention what thematically makes it a truly great game. As the game is over 5 years old, I don't think I have to worry too much about spoilers, but nevertheless, if you haven't played the game, I highly recommend that you go and do so, then come back to this video. Now without further ado, let's take a look at Flower, and what, in my opinion, makes it a game that should be on everyone's metaphorical shelf. The core gameplay mechanics of Flower are quite simple. As I've already explained, the player enters the dreams of flowers in which he or she takes on the role of the wind. As the wind, the player blows a single flower petal around and guides it to locations indicated to the player by visual and auditory cues. To advance the game, the player must find and touch other flowers throughout the level, causing them to bloom and trigger some sort of event, whether it's rejuvenating the land nearby or tracing patterns of light in dark fields, all the while adding more flower petals to the magnificent, multicolored trail of petals the player guides through the level. Although That Game Company has said that a message in their games is secondary to the emotional impact the game delivers, I would argue that Flower's story is one of its greatest strengths as a game. Reviewers often cite the well-crafted emotional arc as a strong point of the game, but there's more to Flower than just emotion. Like with any well-written story, there are multiple messages in Flower which it conveys through its minimalistic elements. Flower's cutscenes are only one facet of the story, and are worth examining as they're rather unique as far as cutscenes go. Cutscenes in Flower show up before the player enters a dream and often show things as they are, rather than a response to events put in motion by the player. For example, the game opens with a shot of heavy traffic at night. The camera slowly pulls away from its focus on the cars to reveal skyscrapers and, in the distance, the tops of cranes and scaffolding. The scene at the beginning of the second level again features the same dreary city and shows buildings through a chain-link fence and colorless brick walls. The actual gameplay portions of the games, the dreams of the flowers, are juxtaposed with this dreary cityscape. The first dream taking the player to a lush green field where he or she rejuvenates dead grass and at the end a dead tree, while the second involves the player literally painting the black and white landscape with more vibrant colors. These cutscenes begin to shift from the oppressive color scheme of the city before the third level, which is the first to feature color. The addition of color in the scene is significant as it indicates that some sort of event or change has occurred, even though, save two dreams, nothing has. But more on this later. These opening scenes are important to keep in mind as they take place in the real world, a world divorced from the portions of the game in which the player makes a difference, the dreams of the flowers. The game's level select screen is the other piece of the storytelling puzzle, which also serves to introduce the element of progression and advancement necessary for any game in a nice, tidy package. Much like the sobering opening cutscene, when the player first begins the game, the level select screen features a gloomy apartment and an ordinary table upon which a potted flower sits. Through the cracked window, laundry hung out to dry obscures the gray skies that threaten an approaching storm, and the only sound to be heard is the ticking of a clock. As the player completes levels, this screen changes, from the gloomy apartment in the first level to the conclusion of the game, when the screen reflects the player's triumphs as cherry blossoms drift past the open apartment window, which looks out over the newly awakened city, and the sounds of children playing and someone practicing violin float into the apartment. Much like the cutscenes, this level select screen also shows the game world as it is, but remains disconnected from the dreams in which the player takes part, yet slowly changes, indicating that something, although we don't know what, is influencing it. Of the 6 levels of Flower, the one that strikes the most chords with me is the 4th. Initially the level was simply stunning. The blue and white color scheme in the early parts of the level is absolutely gorgeous. and for that reason alone ranks as my top level. Yet, as you might expect, there's more to the level than just pretty colors. As I continued to play through, what first seemed like subtle suggestions or innocuous tasks became apparent as something more significant to the overall themes of the game. Consider, for example, the opening sequence of the level. This cutscene is very brief, focusing on a group of street lamps, one of which blinks and then goes out completely. This could be taken as a helpful indicator of what you'll be doing in the level, but can also be interpreted in a symbolic way. The failing of the street lamp could represent a general absence of wonder or imagination in the game's world, which the gloomy atmosphere in the beginning of the game suggests. The light of wonder, as it were, eventually burns out. To contrast with this sobering thought, the level features a slew of imagery which suggests rebirth or revitalization as a way to fill this void. Consider the bales of hay the player lights up throughout the level, which look a lot like eggs, which are of course symbols of life and birth. Also consider the designs the player draws in the fields. The circles bring to mind the circle of life as well as unity, wholeness, and potential, while the spiral represents the path from our outermost desires, materialism, vanity, etc., to enlightenment. After this positive imagery, the lights again fail, but this time in a more jarring manner. Blackness spreads across the ground, crows call ominously, and wind suddenly steers the player into a dark canyon, which without the lamps to guide the player is significantly more difficult to navigate than the earlier parts of the level. At this point in the game's narrative, it would be easy to disregard a more meaningful message and focus on what seemed to be the evils of humanity. But while that suggestion is certainly there, to stop with that reading would be to disregard the last two levels, which take a significant turn for the better, but not without first showing us a glimpse of what a world without imagination and wonder would be like. This fifth dream I consider more of a nightmare. The barren landscape of this level is littered with ruined towers and discarded bits of scaffolding, both of which suggest progress, but the return to the monochromatic color scheme simultaneously asks, at what cost? The end of the level involves the player navigating a maze and concludes with the player rushing toward the end point of the level. One point worth noting is that this is the only level the player can't complete by touching the end point. The level simply fades to black before reaching it, emphasizing that this dream is more of a dream within a dream. Not to mention that this is the only level in which the player can actually take damage. While the humanity is the monster trope is a little overdone, it works particularly well here in Flower because the game doesn't pass judgment. It would be easy to create a video game that reproaches us for the wrongs we do to Mother Nature, much like movies such as Avatar, or even Disney's Pocahontas have done. But at the end of the fifth level, we reach the level select screen, which has become pure white, indicating that the vision of the world in the previous level doesn't have to be the case. And as the beginning of the sixth level indicates, just a single petal can make all the difference. At the end of Flower, the city is not transformed into a little slice of the Garden of Eden, but remains just as it was, a city. Which is significant because it emphasizes that the message of the game is not transformation, but revitalization and rejuvenation. Even the trophies seem to suggest this, which reward the player for taking breaks between levels and resting on the left select screen. Yet thanks to the minimalistic nature of the game, Flower can be interpreted any number of ways. Some see the game as a plea for alternate sustainable sources of energy, as is evident in the third level in which the player flies around breathing life into disused windmills, while others interpret it as a cautionary tale outlining the dangers of global warming. However, neither of these sit well with me, because how do we account for the fact that if the game is proposing an alternate energy source, the only suggested source, wind, fails in the cutscene prior to the fourth level, as well as later on in the level when the lights short out and plunge the level into darkness? If the game were trying to make a statement about wind power, wouldn't the windmills we spent the third level dusting off solve the city's power woes? If on the other hand the game highlights the dangers of global warming, why then doesn't it end on a positive note? Not to mention that it gives us no real practical methods of obtaining the nirvana we see at the conclusion of the game. Instead, I take a more positive message away from Flower. It's important to remember that there are two distinct worlds in Flower, the real world, which is shown to us through the game's cutscenes and level select screen, and the dreams of the flowers, which are all unique and take place in various locations. Both of these worlds are ostensibly separate, and neither influences the other. This seems to be the case anyway, at least until the very end of the game. The last action the player takes in the game is to steer his trailer pedals upwards towards a strangely familiar sight: an apartment window, an ordinary chair, and an empty flower pot. As this event takes place in the flower's dream, this is the point in the game when dreams finally meet reality. In the context of the game, this leads to the rejuvenation of the entire city, which seems to suggest that dreams are a means to achieve this rebirth the game values so much. While the ending is the most significant point at which dreams intertwine with reality, it does seem as though at least a small bit of the influence of these dreams has bled through the barrier before this point. Consider the fact that the first color in the real world is seen just after painting the landscape in the second dream, as well as the gradual reawakening of the city, which seems aided by nothing except the dreams of the flowers. So what does all this junior high-level literary analysis mean? I would argue that Flower conveys two important messages: the importance of dreams and imagination, as without them the real world would be a vapid, lifeless place devoid of wonder, and that dreams can rejuvenate, as the player's actions in the dreams of the flowers directly influence the outside world, which we can see through both the cutscenes and level select screen. I think as gamers get older and start thinking more practically, more logically, and sometimes more cynically, we need games like Flower, which remind us of what it means to be human, what it means to wonder and imagine. But as Keats said, people don't like meaning forced down their throats, so a certain balance of message and interpretation is needed. Flower avoids the ham-fisted attempts at meaning and symbolism some games try to pull off, and communicates its message in a way which doesn't insult the player's intelligence, but encourages them to interpret and figure things out on their own, which is what we need more of if we're ever going to consider this medium a form of art alongside films, music, and literature. Whether Flower is a metaphor for the stagnant game market or a sincere attempt to rejuvenate humanity, I think many developers can learn a lesson from That Game Company. They've shown us through their games that imagination leads to innovation, both of which we can certainly do with more of in the gaming industry.